I think trees are just an ideal large composition life form on Earth that is very pivotal and instrumental in us addressing biodiversity collapse. And so if only we could quantify its value and collateralize the global financial system with that value. Those are the tools that we're trying to build to hopefully make that a reality.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. This is a show about regenerative finance, exploring pathways to a life-affirming economy. I'm your host, Matthew Monahan, and today I am joined by my friend, Jimo Sorodio. He is the founder of Sylvie, and it's his birthday. Happy birthday.
Why, thank you.
So some people call you the tree man. I want to start, what has led to your personal interest and focus on trees?
Well, a lot of it was emergent, but I guess in hindsight, I've always sort of had a green thumb, and I planted trees really early on in life that I've come to realize that I feel it was a natural career. I did envision myself as an ecologist quite early, but I don't see myself as an ecologist now, although I try to fight for nature. But I think I'm definitely more on the business and engineering side of things.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Sylvie, can you take us through at a high level, what is Sylvie?
Well, Sylvie's mission is to support tree planting and tree stewardship. I think that the loss of biodiversity, the biodiversity collapse, can be really simplified into forest cover loss, and the building blocks of that fabric are very much trees. And so we're focused on trying to reverse the current trend, which right now we are losing about 15 billion trees a year, and we're only planting about 2 billion, and we're not really planting the right trees. And we've lost about half of all trees on the planet.
Since when?
Well, there's been different reasons for tree loss. Historically, it's mostly been for construction materials, and this is over the last few centuries. And over the last century, it's transitioned from sort of a combination of fuel, charcoal, but predominantly more recently with population spike, it's been agriculture expansion.
Mm-hmm. Got it. So we're losing 15 billion trees a year. We're replanting 2. That replacement rate needs to be in excess of what we're losing because we have a lot of restoration to go. So still a huge gap. People may recognize you. We did a conversation at Earth Commons, and you were on kind of a group panel with us about how do we plant 1 trillion trees, this kind of aspiration. Is that kind of the framing that you like to adhere to in terms of what the size and scale of the project ahead entails?
Yeah, I think it's a symbolic, rounded number that we can grasp. And in reality, we've lost 3 trillion. There is a realistic path to recovering 1 trillion. Restoring all 3 lost trillion would require completely reversing agriculture and human settlement, which is impossible. I personally would like to think that a lot of that agriculture can actually be retired, and there's really a path to 2 trillion.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that is a next step.
Mm-hmm.
At the current rate, there's really no difference between 1 and 2 trillion.
Mm-hmm.
The sense of urgency, that's a kind of a rounding error.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're to meet 2030 or 30 by 30 targets, there's just an immense amount of work that needs to be done, and in a very short time frame.
Mm-hmm.
And so that exponential growth, if it can accommodate 1 trillion, I think it can also accommodate 2 trillion trees.
Right. Because if we're planting 2 billion a year, that means it's going to take us 500 years to get to 1 trillion, and we need to get to that kind of a rough time frame.
And we'll never get there if we're still continuing to lose 15, right? It'll maintain a negative
right.
trend. So, yeah.
Right. So, Bill Gates was in the headlines a couple months ago being dismissive of tree planting, and that's not going to solve climate change. And there's a lot of capital being placed in direct air capture technologies and kind of new industry forming around that. There's kind of demand on the carbon credit side that says, oh, trees burn down, there can be droughts, like there's all these unpredictable issues with weather. So we need to do, enhanced rock weathering and kind of focus on permanence of carbon drawdown and sequestration. And here you are kind of like whittling down to the atomic unit level of like, no guys, trees, like focus here. Help me understand, yeah, how you think about the narrative and some of those comments that have emerged and, sentiments in the industry.
Yeah. Well, Bill Gates is also the biggest short seller of Tesla, amongst other things.
Mm.
So there are some things that don't add up for me, at least in my book. Yes. Well, the atomic perspective of trees is that their biomass include carbon, obviously, and there's a lot of carbon sequestration potential there. But I think what's more important to realize are the life support system that trees maintain. Whether one sees this through the lens of creationism or emergent properties, it doesn't really change the fact that without tree and forest restoration, we're not doing much for biodiversity restoration. And I do believe that certain topsoils can be accelerated with, advanced weather type of chemistry and permanence and weathering techniques. And there's a lot to be said there. I also think that direct air capture has a place, perhaps more for sort of catalytic conversion in pollutants, and maybe even some raw materials. But I don't claim that trees are the end-all be-all solution, and I don't think any one of those are either. But they need to come together. My priority is biodiversity. At the end of the day, I'm more excited about COP16 and the biodiversity angle than climate as a whole. Not trying to be a skeptic of climate or global warming. But I also do recognize that if we just focus on carbon, that carbon itself will not survive the sort of geological timescale. What happens if we are in a positive carbon sequestration trend? And what happens 70 years later when perhaps we've sequestered too much carbon but done nothing to restore life on Earth? And so biodiversity has taken millions, if not billions of years to be established. And I think we need to help rehabilitate that from the ground up.
Right. So, okay, sticking with the 15 billion trees we're losing a year, 2 billion that we're planting, what do you see as the key action steps to stem that deforestation and the destruction of the current habitat?
So many ways to answer that question. I don't know. I think what is least deniable is unit economics and just a business case for reforestation. If we can reduce costs by an order of magnitude, I think we can accelerate this by a lot more.
Reducing the cost of replanting, you mean, or reducing the costs? Like, how do we stop cutting them all down?
Yeah, I mean that can also happen from a penalization or taxation perspective as well. So it's sort of the price elasticity here is such that if we were to, cut restoration costs in half, I think we can accelerate restoration adoption by 4, 5, 6x. And so if we can really reduce significantly, I think all of a sudden the trillion tree is achievable. And so there's that economic business angle that I think is just a sobering reminder of how supply and demand works. But the techniques to getting there are, I think, really come down to quite sophisticated stack of conditions, technologies, and conditions that need to come together. I think one that is appealing is that we as a society and as a species kind of come together in this coordination. And so that inherently means that responsibility is not limited to a very small group of stakeholders, but that we sort of distribute and decentralize participation as much as possible. And even 1% of 8 billion is a huge number.
Right.
But, aspirationally, 5-10% participation would mean that this is really sort of regeneration as a participation, or as almost a not necessarily a full-time career, but meaningful incentives and meaningful personal and emotional investment into this work. And so I do think there's a role for gamification. I do think there's a role for monetary compensation. And that's at sort of the participatory scale. But then there are so many other angles. I think one is science and data. Just yesterday, I attended a talk at the New York Botanical Garden called Super Trees, looking at the role that large native trees can play in timber and non-timber forest products, and even maybe in the biodiversity credit roadmap. But it really looked at solving the individual use cases for different trees that are currently not commercialized. And there are thousands of examples. Some have berries or nuts or fruits or resin or gum or timber, sustainably harvested timber. And so each of them needs to be reinvented and reintroduced. And so this requires sort of what I like to consider species and location specific methodologies. And I think right now it's okay to focus on just a few species and really nail down their life cycle milestones and how we can participate in restoring them. But ultimately that needs to scale very quickly as well. Perhaps not to all 70,000 tree species, but a big chunk of them.
Right. So is that selection you mentioned, out of the 2 billion that we're planting, you said a lot of them are, I can't remember the exact words, but so is it mostly selection of trees, or placement, or the aftercare after we plant them, all of the above? Like what about it needs to be improved in that respect?
Yeah. Well, a big chunk of those 2 billion trees are maybe half a dozen species. Your poplars, pines, eucalyptus.
Right.
These are commercial
Right.
trees, often genetically modified, and often planted in a monocrop layout with little contributions to biodiversity, and kind of treated very much as an agricultural product. And with long-term consequences to their habitat, etc. And so there are many alternative native species that can still fulfill some of those commercial needs, but if done in conjunction with ecological health, can still fulfill harvesting needs, but do so more sustainably while maintaining and restoring local plant life, local fauna, and local weather and chemistry patterns, etc. So some things might not appear commercial yet, but I am ultimately excited at the role that net setting, whether it's carbon or biodiversity responsibility, can do to kind of subsidize this work, and perhaps pave the path to finding alternative commercialization in these native and indigenous varieties.
So tell me more about that frame, net setting. What does that mean?
Yeah, net setting was an outcome of a conversation with ChatGPT between Gregory Lendway and myself, in kind of understanding what is a good term to reflect sort of insetting and offsetting across scope 1 through 3. And so net setting was this sort of middle ground to represent all of those potential efforts, as Gregory explains really well, as this new responsibility that businesses and companies and entities and governments should take in playing a role in reversing some of the damage that has occurred. And it's not all limited to carbon footprints, right? And so there are all these sort of ecological sacrifices that have been made that perhaps this holistic insetting mindset and taxation and can play a role in perhaps even subsidizing and creating a sort of actual monetary stimulus.
Got it. So it's kind of the combination of the activities that might be involved in offsetting, which would be like, planting trees because we emitted over here, and so we're kind of making up for it over there, versus insetting, which might be a reduction in our carbon footprint within our supply chain and within the activities we're doing. Is it net settings trying to kind of give a frame to the cumulative effect of all of these activities?
I think net setting is really meant to be an umbrella term for all of those activities.
Got it.
And I think you just brought up, perhaps, for example, some of the controversial discussions between, is biodiversity offsetting fungible or not, right? And many think that, hey, ecological restoration is very unique to a place, but others might say that, hey, for this to really take off commercially and as a eco credit, it needs to have fungibility. And actually agree with that. And so I think there are sort of first principles that can recognize biodiversity uplift qualities, or biogeochemical trends that can be summarized in indicators, right? Independent of the unique butterfly or bird, or in indicator species that they're supporting. I think those trends and those ecosystem services can be somewhat summarized. And so I do see a path for biodiversity credits or frameworks to kind of have some scalable, universal measuring system.
Got it. So how does that look? I mean, because obviously there's all these trade-offs once we create something that's fungible or reduce nature and biodiversity down to simple metrics. So what's your vision for how this would evolve?
Again, I don't think I can distill it to any single outcome. What I'm feeling very called to do is to focus on trees as a uniquely positioned and uniquely important asset class for the bigger natural capital discussion. And we can compare and contrast the role of trees and jaguars, for example. At the end of the day, I do think trees are actually easier to document and measure as sort of stationary beings with various contributions to an ecosystem and various recipes in conjunction with other species that can achieve some of these restoring properties. And so the goal at Sylvie is to, on one end, coordinate stewardship and impact, but then on the other is really to try and measure that value creation as a sort of derivative data layer for natural capital accounting. So the MRV side, the monitoring, reporting, and verification side, has been built with a focus on census-based accounting, meaning the ability to measure each and every tree and to understand what are the specific allometric curves and models of those unique trees, or perhaps in conjunction with with the planting recipes, etc. But then on the other hand is, what is the outcome? And that is a bit less census-based and more area-based accounting, but it's more, what is the entire natural capital stock of a hectare or a restored land. And so I think there have been gaps on one side on natural capital accounting as a whole, it's still evolving and it's far from settled. But on the other, I think from an MRV perspective, there were incredible gaps in census-based accounting that have very recently, I think, been addressable from a convergence of technologies and mobile adoption and internet and handheld cameras, etc. And so we at Sylvie started a little bit more improving the MRV, being able to pay stewards on the ground for impact, being able to configure these methodologies that describe the milestones we want to see. But now we're recognizing that for the world to really come together and for this coordination to scale, we really need to solve data interoperability. And perhaps that's a little bit more where Trikipedia as a recent focus of ours has been, to kind of hopefully be able to solve for broader natural capital accounting frameworks.
Got it. So what I hear you saying is, obviously we're moving into this new paradigm of natural capital in general, that underpins this huge, shift in this decade, coming decades that we have to go through. And there's still been a lot of, discussion, debate, refinement of methodologies around, what are the most effective ways to track things like carbon and measurements and credits and so forth, census-based accounting, et cetera. And but really the atomic unit of trees it's a simple, basic foundational building block to our habitat, into our ecosystems that can underpin and kind of support the measurement and the legibility of this very large space that we're kind of framing as natural capital. And the methodologies, yes, are continuing to improve. The ways that we report and that we verify this is also something that you guys have been working on, but that you're also honing in on this key issue of interoperability. And that's leading you to Trikipedia. So yeah, I would love to hear more. What is Trikipedia? What is this initiative and so forth? But also, did I kind of get that initial premise right?
Yeah, there is in fact a lot of tree data out there on the internet, but it's not all consistent and aligned. And Sylvie is also a little bit built on the Web3 layer with smart contracts and with distributed storage on IPFS, etc. And so our model is really around achieving interoperability across protocols with this idea that, of course, Sylvie will not solve everything, but how can we contribute? How can we add value that is then composable with other systems, other protocols, like Open Forest Protocol, Gainforests, Restore.eco, and others. And for us to be able to interoperate, we need to be speaking the same data language. And I do see a huge gap here. As much as there are massive databases, like Wikipedia has a sub-project called Wikispecies. It has a sub-project called Wikimedia. So it is doing a lot to combine open source media files and images with individual species pages. And there's a certain taxonomy there. There are other databases like GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. Another massive one is iNaturalist. There's a huge push to digitalize formerly analog data. But at the end of the day, this data is not fully interoperable. For example, we mostly agree that a scientific name for a species is a scientific name, but some databases look at the term common name, and others look at it as a vernacular name. And there are many languages to common names. And so there's still a little bit of a consolidation effort needed for us to be able to agree and say that, hey, this tree has this identifier. It's this unique ID in a global observation database. These are the common names by different languages. And then on top of that, also agree on the ontologies, on the methodologies, to be able to look at a tree and say, yes, it was in fact planted in this date by this steward. It has these methodologies prescribed. We can all understand those methodologies. And this is what Trikipedia aspires to help, is to consolidate a lot of these fields and lists to achieve a tree data standard that inspires interoperability, even if we can still refer back to originally a GPIF species page, for example. And we hope this can become a working group that is open source with an associated repository. We have 4 members working on Trikipedia right now, and it's the type of effort that I wish had already been there. We're doing it for ourselves, but we really hope that others can adopt and participate in this initiative as well.
Yeah. It's astonishing. We don't have it. Glad that we're getting started and working on it. And so that interoperability, you see, that will, essentially just increase the velocity, the know-how, the intelligence, so that we start planting the right tree in the right place more, so that we can, make these systems more interoperable. Because, those who aren't necessarily in the details of building technology tools and so forth, there's an incredible difference between, everyone using different silos and competing and walled gardens or whatever, versus we have a shared language, a shared standard, and like what's possible then unlocks new types of applications and network effects and velocity and scale, which is really what we're talking about. The problem, like 2 billion to, what, 50 billion, 75 billion a year. That's like, how do we 25 to 40x our kind of tree planting efforts while making them more intelligent?
Totally. And Common Aim is really the tip of the iceberg, right? It gets a lot more technical, like diameter at breast height as a measurement of trees. There's different approaches to how these measurements are done. There's not enough consistency in its interpretation. And then the very complicated models behind trees. Some are more sort of photosynthetic rates, other are more the growth curvatures, and then how are those even calculated as individual isolated trees versus with penalization scores, for example, if they're growing in the middle of a canopy. So there's really no foundational system for sort of a tree intelligence commons and how we can then all contribute towards the same mission. And really hopeful that Trikipedia allows us to contribute to that velocity, but that it also inspires adoption by others. And so far it's going well.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I'm thinking about the experience I had personally. It was right before and during the pandemic. I was on the farm in New Zealand, and we had about a hectare and a half of mature radiata pine that had been planted 30 years ago. It was time to come out. This is a commercial genetically modified crop designed for maximum, growth speed, and it's been a huge economic driver for the country of New Zealand. Doesn't necessarily serve the soil life and the biodiversity and some of the other aspects of the habitat as effectively as one might hope. But they've had their place in the story of New Zealand. And anyway, it was very hard, first off, to just get the trees out of there because it was too small of a scale to get some sort of commercial harvester, but it was too big to do it ourselves. And the log prices of what you would get paid for shipping them down to the port were really poor. So it was like, wow, we're like cutting trees down, which is painful. We're paying money to do it, which is painful. And it's a dicey situation because there's like houses and, access and all these things that have happened over the last 30 years that make like the site a little bit, hard to work with. And, but we're like, okay, great. This will be a pilot project to kind of like learning a little bit more about restoration of a clear-felled pine radiata area back into native permanent restoration. And what we learned was a lot of different things. One thing we quickly learned was that we weren't going to be able to plant the trees back because there were too many goats, rabbits, browsing, invasive species in New Zealand coming in from over the hills that we couldn't control. And so we would have to do a pretty big fencing job, which was also very costly and difficult to access in different ways and so forth. But okay, got the fencing job, put a perimeter around it, got the trees out. Um, yeah, I mean, I was like, we're trying to learn, okay, well, about the beech forests that used to be present in this valley before human settlement, and what are the beech types of trees. But I'm piecing together, Google searches, and there's a great group in New Zealand called Tane's Tree Trust. It's a simple WordPress website with some research, with a lot of people, the previous generation who've done their best to kind of synthesize knowledge of, what trees could go where in New Zealand. But we're talking about kind of still somewhat small efforts relative to the importance of the problem. And yeah, I was finding texts from like the 70s and the 80s that were like the most relevant to, kind of what's the playbook for restoring beech forests, and what are the companion species and things that we need to plant at the same time. Then we contact the nurseries and we're like, okay, who has these silver beech and black beech and red beech? And should we put red beech? Red beech was mostly on the South Island. And are we going to be able to do eco sourcing, local sourcing of seed? The commercial nurseries charge quite a bit of money, and so we're trying to get some sort of discount rates. Pine radiata we can get for less than $1, and they don't require fences because the browsing animals don't really eat them. And all we would have to do is stick a shovel in the ground and just kind of like wedge it, and then throw the pine in, and then that would be it. Like that's like the planting effort. Whereas with these beech trees, it's like actually you need a weed mat, you need kind of a cover, you need to dig a better hole, you need to make sure that it's getting enough water straight away. And so we start looking at the unit costs, and we're like, this isn't just like 3 or 4 times as expensive. This is like 10 times as expensive per tree. Then we're trying to figure out how do you space the trees out? Should we do rows, or should we just do kind of a little bit more hodgepodge and random? And who's going to help us with all of this? So we call up our friends and post it on Facebook, and we do this like tree planting party, and we're going to serve you some barbecue, and we're going to have some music. But like, oh, by the way, you're going to do a few hours of pretty heavy work on this very steep, surface. And then we're doing the health and safety, and we're getting the shovels out, and there's not enough gloves. And we were very blessed by circumstance in that, it was a good weather day. We got good rains that winter so that the survival rate held. We learned that we probably shouldn't have put the beech in straight away. We should have let, another season or 2 pass. We did a lot of manuka and kind of more fast canopy cover trees. But our frame just kept being like native, like what was here before. And do our best to tend the survival rate. Don't just do a one and done plant and go away. So kind of tend to it. We learned that there's all sorts of invasive weeds that we don't even know how to necessarily always identify, and there's different points of view about whether those weeds will be good canopy cover or not. And then like neighbors have different points of view on whether they want all those weeds there and all those seeds flowing into their paddock. And yeah, and one other thing was like there was a natural trail that started to emerge because we needed to access the site, and we kept all using that track. And then it became kind of the skeleton in the early version of a walking path. And now, whatever it is, 4 years later, like the people who live adjacent to that site, like we all really value and love that area and that space. It's watching an ecosystem come back to life, all the good, the bad, the humbling bits of it as well. But we use that trail, right? And then we kind of like start carving out little other pathways and spaces. And there's this little trickling thing over the waterfall rock, that we can kind of like in big rains, you can kind of put your head under it and swim under it. And like it becomes this group collective project of relationship. But yeah, it was a super humbling exercise of like, we have a lot to do. This is challenging work when we had enough resources to do all of that. And it's going to take decades for this to really kind of mature and come back into an ecosystem. Super exciting when you see cool native birds and you're like, yeah, like we help support that. And hopefully the kids one day will, really enjoy this. But Um, yeah, I guess I share it all just to kind of like keep trying to anchor it back into an example, but then also to open the conversation of where are the tools that Sylvie, Trichopedia, and the many efforts that you're stewarding going to support and assist in that type of example, which is obviously very specific to one place, one local, manifestation.
Really appreciate your story. There's so many nuggets
Great.
there. Yeah, look, a decade or two ago, you couldn't just call Uber and wait 2 minutes for a ride to pick you up,
Right.
or sell or buy used furniture on Facebook Marketplace, or catch up to news faster on Instagram stories or Twitter updates directly from people across the world.
Mm.
I think this is going back to this participatory scaling. I think there is a role for a lot of people to partake in this, but there are also these gaps, these barriers, and these challenges. Whether it's fencing, as you mentioned, I'm not looking to fencing, but often I think about, hey, fencing needs to be like innovated and optimized for reforestation. The
Totally.
costs, the shipping and deployment, the mobility, meaning the temporary installations with the intention of relocating it just a few hectares down the road, and with this idea that it will serve that region, but without too much labor needed to put it up and take it down. I mean, there's all these like optimizations that need to happen.
Mm-hmm.
We have been focused over the last 2 years in trying to solve the unit economics, and perhaps mostly with a certain type of user group. Sylvie has registered 400 and something users so far. Many of those users are in Kenya, and we are working. What we would consider our flagship project is a Kakamega forest in Kenya, which is the last remaining tropical rainforest in all of East Africa, and it was once connected to the broader Congo rainforest. And it's being lost. It's reduced to about 100 square kilometers, and it has very unique composition of life that I think is worthy of protecting, but also that conflict of human and wildlife and agriculture and native forest is also present around the world. And so it's a great use case for us. What we've been able to prove there is that you can, in fact, motivate a community to grow saplings at scale, native saplings, and compensate that community through the seed collection, propagation, and planting and stewardship milestones. Every area is different. Some have herding that needs to be intervened. Others have perhaps more weeding necessary, following up to the tree planting event. In some cases, fencing, and we have actually a fence already being put in place for wildlife purposes. That's also relevant for cattle and whatnot. And we have been able to compensate the community more so comparatively to a base salary in the country, while producing saplings for less than what sourcing them from a commercial nursery supplier would cost. So this kind of means that those unit economics can scale, and that the associated incentive behind that is of demand. But there are so many other things that need to be improved on. We are quite focused on mobile capture right now, knowing that it's never going to be the best MRV camera system, and it can be streamlined into robotics, into drones, and even satellites. We're not necessarily trying to innovate in the satellite space or building tree counting algorithms, because so many people are working on that. But also, truthfully, by the time a tree is recognizable from space, it has to be 5-6 years old. Mm-hmm. And so that's already close to 2030. So really just focus on how do we accelerate tree stewardship at the beginning of the tree life cycle. Mm-hmm. But there are still many things left to innovate on. In hindsight, I think the priorities we've taken do add up and make sense. We could certainly use help and additional resources and additional case studies and examples. But
Mm-hmm.
I recognize all the challenges you faced, and sometimes throwing a party, it sounds fun and appealing, but fails to address the complexities of know-how and
Mm-hmm.
subject matter expertise and nuanced techniques on how to dig a hole or put the root correctly. But it's almost easier to see a mature version of our planet where the work needed to restore a particular piece of land is supported by all these tools and databases and guidelines and methodologies.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes a little bit more automatable. Again, coming back to if I need to go to the other side of town, I call the Uber, but I'm not really paying attention at
Mm-hmm.
all the background algorithms working for optimizing the right car to come pick me up or
Right.
the fastest route there. It's
Right.
kind of happening in the background. And so there's so much that's needed
Mm-hmm.
to build this background support system for restoration. And yeah, each and one of those pieces can be unpacked in 1 hour conversations, but there's a lot of work happening.
Right, because so I could just click Wikipedia, know what species made sense in my area. I could just have a bioregional nursery with the local species and kind of more of a bioregional plan about the corridors and the restoration, and they could inform me like, yeah, this is what's going on and this is what's needed. I could get those at a cost that's maybe not just competitive with the more suboptimal previous generation of our commodity economy strategy, but actually get paid to do this work, right? Like I could actually get the tree for free because the global economic system is recognizing the indispensable value of this restoration.
Let me take it home for you. So, One Earth, they have, amongst many things, a navigator that looks at the world map through the lens of zones. Some of these zones are bioregional zones, and they've actually taken a step forward in defining smaller ecoregions.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one resource. There's Samantha Power's bioregional finance facilities looking at, localism and coordination and governance, often looking at, indigenous peoples and local communities as the very stewards. How can we bridge those two efforts, and how can we connect them? And so with Wikipedia, we are hoping to launch not only one of the largest tree species lists with as much surface area for interoperability. Over time, we intend to fill gaps in terms of methodologies and guidelines. But one of the first steps is to perhaps align tree lists to specific bioregions and ecoregions, such that any person can be in a given ecoregion and know, without much work or additional research, what is the local composition of trees in your area. What might be an ideal planting density of a hectare, perhaps for a riparian ecosystem or a higher altitude ecosystem or an average forest canopy, but still with some optimization around the specific bioregion or ecoregion. And so these preferred species lists or species aptness scores, there's many ways to cut the pie there, but these are resources that I think can just help tremendously in automating and templating just how to get started with restoration. Of course, there's still gaps around unique stewardship events. Some trees might do better with cloning super tree samples, such as coastal redwoods, for example, where we actually want to multiply proven trees. Others, we might just want to collect seed at scale and maybe choose the most viable saplings. So there are many nuanced details there, but it's right now we wouldn't be able to approach an ecoregion and cut to the chase and skip so much tedious research.
Right.
But through the cleaning of this data and the alignment to other resources that are out there, like One Earth's ecoregion zoning tiles, all of a sudden this resource should be available pretty soon. So very excited for that.
Yeah. Okay. So we've kind of brushed over many different types of issues and opportunities that are coming together in terms of the science and the tooling. I did want to drill in a little bit deeper around the insight that you have around the unit economics. I completely agree, and I think that's something that most people who have the technology or the science lens aren't giving as much of an attention to, or I often hear kind of like, well, that's not my field of expertise, or that's not my specialty. Um, and the people who do think about the economics, it's an even smaller group who are deep in Web3 and blockchain and crypto and what this means. And yeah, you're kind of one of the few people I've met who's really trying to synthesize and figure out in practice what's the plan for how do we bring all these things together into actual funding mechanisms. So yeah, with that as the tee off point, tell me more.
Right. I mean, the unit economics are important because unless they work, nothing else can scale. But I think what you're alluding to is how do we ultimately make all of this investable? How can we really recognize trees as an investable asset class? How can we collateralize the green bonds with trees? And so I think this involves understanding how money in returns value in the long run, trying to understand what is that time horizon, perhaps the biological, obviously the geological time horizon is the longest. The biological is, somewhere in the middle, maybe 5 to 50 years, or maybe less, to be a little bit less conservative. But then maybe there's a shorter time horizon of confidence, sort of a statistical proven confidence that, hey, if we meet these steps, these milestones, we know that the rest will come together. And maybe that is, hopefully what we're in the process of proving. We're 2 years into this process. I think within another 3, 4, 5 years, we can really start to see what has worked and what hasn't worked. And there's so much modeling and referencing that is also happening around the world with other projects and with untouched ecology, et cetera, that I think can guide this process. But the idea here is how can we truly invest into trees, but not as a share of a fund putting money into a project developer in some country? I think how can we truly kind of really pursue that digital twin, synthetic digitized tree token? I think there's a lot there that is fun and symbolic and mimetic. And so that's what we hope to do with Sylvie is, can we launch a token that is actually backed by a tree somewhere? That requires actually different tokens. So there's really a stack, a pair of tokens. So you have your traditional fungible token, usually an ERC20 token, which is tradable, even spot tradable. They're typically in a basket. Toucan has done this for carbon credits. We hope we can do the same. And maybe these baskets represent a price bracket or a normalized value of a portfolio of different projects, for instance. And so that's a tradable tree token represented by a real tree. But then we need the non-fungible tree identity. And maybe that is a little bit more of a non-fungible token or non-fungible tree. NF tree there's been some mimetic work in the space. But those really need to be represented by associated claim history, logging history, MRV history, a string of data that represents that tree. And so these two things come together. There's so much that you can build on top of that token pair, whether it's ownership or transferability or transactionability. And I think Web3 offers the tools, the smart contract layer, the interoperability layer, assuming Trickypedia is anchored in this space. Yeah, we're not there yet. We haven't launched a token. We hope to launch a token, and we're still in the process of of launching an inaugural portfolio of projects where we have put money in and we have started to see value come out, and we hope this becomes an attractive asset class, perhaps represented by tokens, that all types of investors or corporates or philanthropy, or perhaps some of other tools, some of which you're working on, might leverage.
Mm-hmm. Do you see this as sitting like as an evolution of the carbon markets and carbon credits? Do you see this as part of that system? Do you see it as completely separate? Like, obviously, there's a myriad of different opinions and views and understandings of carbon markets in general as well, but help frame like how this relates to carbon and carbon credits.
I do think carbon is flawed, just the way we've looked at carbon. Going back to the geological timescale, what happens when our trend of carbon sequestration is trending down? The value of carbon will continue to diminish. There won't be much value in sequestering carbon. I know this sounds very far-fetched right now because we're dealing with a climate crisis, but there's some this if we aggressively put the systems in place to sequester carbon at the rate we need, in assuming we meet those targets or fall slightly behind, is still irrelevant. In 50 to 100 years, we will be in a place where we have all these systems that are sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. And so restoring biodiversity is more of a buffer sponge system, where we know we can sequester that surplus, but we're stabilizing the planet. Mm-hmm. Whereas these direct air capture systems, if they're the main systems in place, at some point they will have to be retired because they're obsolete or they're not necessary, and we actually might then face the risk of sequestering too much carbon too quickly. So while permanence is attributed to this 1,000-year time scale, it's funny that it's not typically seen through the lens of forest restoration. Mm-hmm. So I do think what we need to see is biodiversity restoration with 1,000-year permanence. I mean, that would be the ultimate system to inspire everybody to work towards. I think ultimately what should dictate value, and this is a basic economic principle, is this idea of scarcity and utility. And we've often looked at gold as a reserve system that even the US dollar has been backed by and pegged to. And often gold is also used as a comparison to Bitcoin as a digital gold, because Bitcoin has reserve and transactional utility, and it has scarcity by its limited supply. And I think one of the grounding visions at Sylvie is how can we realize that value from life itself, and not just life as a whole, the miracle of life, of course, but perhaps trees. And so we actually have, I've said this in the past in a previous interview with you, I believe, but we have more gold in our immediate solar system, and of course in the larger universe. Some celestial bodies alone have more diamond mass than all of Earth combined, right? So these belong in the periodic table. There might be scarce in one place and more abundant in others, but what we haven't seen is life itself. And specific to life, I think trees are just an ideal, large composition life form on Earth that is very pivotal and instrumental in us addressing biodiversity collapse. And so, if only we could quantify its value and collateralize the global financial system with that value, those are the tools that we're trying to build to hopefully make that a reality.
Trees are more precious and rare than gold.
Absolutely. Yeah. With more emergent properties too.
Yeah, I really do resonate with the simplicity of the thesis, that trees as a building block, and to bring it home in a different practical example of what we've been exploring at Ma Earth, we ran uh, a grants round earlier this year that essentially put up a matching pool of philanthropic capital, and two dozen different land projects went to their communities and fundraised, and the amount that they raised and from the number of contributors helped inform how much of the matching pool they received. And we did this with Gitcoin, and it's essentially our first kind of experiment in this area of using Web3 blockchains to distribute capital to place-based projects and to, essentially start to cohere more learnings and experiments in this space. And the grant size on average received by the projects in the end was about $10,000. So not huge in terms of, doesn't pay for a full-time staff member in most cases. It doesn't, buy a new tractor. It's just a one-time grant. So there's no, kind of predictability of what the grant will be next year, et cetera. And it was so fascinating to me to see, well, what did they spend it on? Right. And we curated projects through an application process that were very high quality, land stewardship projects of different scales, but everything from, small 1 acre permaculture garden to, the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Initiative, kind of thinking about Amazonian rainforest restoration at scale. And what I noticed is that there were a few common use cases out of that experiment. And the most popular was tree planting, because it's the kind of incremental expense that a lot of projects want to do. Like, I talk to farmers in New Zealand, they know that they should do more wildlife corridors. They know they should do more silvopasture. They know they want to do more riparian planting along the river. And they do, in different farms, do different degrees of it. But, it's like winter season comes around. Okay, you do a few more trees and you just kind of chip away at it every year. But if you have kind of this, grant, this new ability to add some expenditure to your land, and it's brought in with the intention of regeneration, it's quite common to say, okay, great, this allows us to go get some more trees, or to go help with the labor costs and the fencing costs or whatever associated with more tree planting. And it's very, like, you still have to squint, but you can see how the systems could really support the MRV, the measuring, reporting, verification of, okay, well, how many trees did you plant, or take a picture of the trees that you put in the ground, or what were the tree planting events and who was involved in that, and the impact certificates and the canopy covers and the tracking over time. And like, all of these things could be enabled. It shouldn't be a huge onerous to the farmer to do all of that work. Like, we need the tools to make it like uber simple, right? Like, we got to get there, and that's what you and I got to figure out. But the atomic unit of tree planting just made sense. And yes, there's a whole bunch of other stuff to go do. And, one of the other ones, just, I guess, to authentically communicate what we noticed, was glasshouse and greenhouse infrastructure, where people, they need that extra $5, $10, $15,000 to do, more protective area for their seedlings, or to grow more crops, in more of a climate, resilient way. And so I thought that was quite interesting. And the Web3 community, when we got their applications for the round, we received a lot of applications from projects we didn't even know were watching us, and kind of from all over the world. And when we asked, how do you intend to measure the impact of your work, the two things that kept coming back were Sylvie and HyperCerts. And so, you and Hoke have really emerged, I think, within this small but growing Web3 community, as, people want to figure out how to use your tools to plug in the MRV and the impact reporting. And I take it as, here we are in 2024, and this is where we're at as a community and ecosystem. And how do we keep making them interoperable and keep growing and keep building? And just, my final shill, I guess, is we're about to launch applications for grants round 2. So by the time this is published, it's applications have been live and we're well underway. So we're going to keep iterating these systems, and acknowledgments to you. You were part of that grants round. You joined some of our Zoom calls. We're onboarding new people into Web3. You were offering to help them with various technical aspects of a lot of questions people have about setting up wallets or dealing with layer 2s or all of these things. So thank you for your generosity of spirit in that regard.
I hope you're the true legend in this space. I really appreciate everything you're doing, Matthew.
Cool. Well, thank you, Jimo. Any other final words, comments, things that you wanted to share?
I'm really excited for the work you're leading too. I know you'll be announcing a lot more in the HyperCert space. So help us help you, and let's collaborate, and Godspeed.
Yeah, Operation Web3, and let's get there. I mean, 15 billion, 2 billion, but we can do it. We can do this. Thank you, Jimo, for joining us, especially on your birthday here at New York Climate Week. For more, go to sylvie.earth. For more conversations like this one, just go to maearth.com. Like, share, subscribe. And if you want to go deeper on these topics and you're working on these types of systems, please reach out, contact us. We're always open and exploring new collaborations. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next one.